The candles flickered in their crystal chandeliers, casting dancing shadows across the gilded walls of Versailles as the cream of French nobility mingled in the Hall of Mirrors. It was 1760, and the air hummed with gossip, intrigue, and the rustle of silk gowns worth more than a common man's lifetime earning. But one conversation that evening would grow silent in a way that made nearby courtiers uncomfortable, their laughter dying as they sensed something wrong, something impossible unfolding before them. Countess von Georgi, an elegant woman in her 70s whose family lineage traced back to the oldest houses of Europe, stood frozen before a gentleman who had been introduced to her as the Count of Saint Germain. Her wineglass trembled in her hand, deep red liquid threatening to spill onto the marble floor. Those who witnessed the encounter later recalled how all color drained from her face, how her lips moved soundlessly for several heartbeats before she could form words. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a tremor that had nothing to do with her advanced age. She had met this man before, she insisted. Not last season in Paris, not at some forgotten ball a few years past. No, she had known him in Venice in 1710, a full 50 years earlier, when she herself had been a young woman of 20. And here stood the impossible truth before her. He looked exactly the same. Not merely well-preserved or youthful for his years. Identical. The same smooth skin, the same dark eyes that seemed to hold centuries behind them, the same enigmatic smile now playing at the corners of his mouth as he regarded her mounting terror. The Count leaned closer, and witnesses say his voice carried a strange quality, almost musical, certainly not threatening, yet somehow deeply unsettling. He asked her politely, as one might request a favor about something trivial, to keep their little secret, just between the two of them. Then he smiled, that knowing smile, and turned to engage another guest in conversation about ancient Mesopotamian art, speaking with the casual authority of someone who had walked those streets himself. Who was this man who haunted the courts of Europe like a ghost in gentleman's clothing? This is the question that has tantalized historians, occultists, and mystery enthusiasts for more than 2.5 centuries. The Count of Saint Germain appeared and disappeared across 300 years of recorded history, never aging, never dying, always possessing knowledge that should have been impossible, speaking languages that scholars spent lifetimes mastering, demonstrating familiarity with events that happened long before any mortal man could have witnessed them. The encounter is documented by reliable witnesses, by nobility and scholars, by those with no reason to fabricate, paint a picture that defies rational explanation. And the question that sends a chill down the spine is not merely who he was, but whether he walks among us still, ageless and unknowable, watching our modern world with those same dark, ancient eyes. The mystery begins at Versailles, but it does not end there. Not by a long measure. In the spring of 1721, rumors began circulating through the salons of Venice about a peculiar stranger who had appeared without warning in the city's most exclusive circles. He carried no letters of introduction, possessed no title that anyone could verify, and yet spoke with an authority that suggested intimate familiarity with the courts of Europe. His name, he said, was the Comte de Saint-Germain, though no herald or genealogist could trace such a lineage. What made him truly remarkable was not his mysterious origins, but rather the impossible claims that followed in his wake, whispers that would persist for decades and transform him into one of the 18th century's most enigmatic figures. The man who would become known as Saint Germain first entered documented history during an era consumed by the promise and peril of transformation. The 1720s and 30s represented the final flowering of serious alchemical pursuit among the European elite, a time when kings still employed court alchemists, and the boundary between chemistry and magic remained tantalizingly unclear. Newton himself had filled notebooks with alchemical formulae, seeking the philosopher's stone with the same rigor he applied to mathematics. The dream of transmutation obsessed an entire civilization. If base metals could become gold, if the fundamental nature of matter itself could be altered through knowledge and will, then perhaps the ultimate transformation awaited those with sufficient wisdom. Perhaps death itself could be overcome. Into this atmosphere of feverish possibility stepped a figure who seemed to embody every alchemical promise. Saint Germain appeared to be a man of indeterminate age, perhaps 40, perhaps 60, with dark penetrating eyes and a manner of dress that suggested wealth without ostentation. He spoke at least a dozen languages with native fluency, including several ancient tongues that even scholars struggled to master. His knowledge of chemistry and metallurgy exceeded that of professional practitioners, and he demonstrated technical abilities that left witnesses genuinely disturbed. The earliest verified accounts place him in London around 1743, though fragmentary evidence suggests he may have been present in various European cities for years before that. By 1748, he had established himself in Vienna, where he caught the attention of the Austrian court. It was here that the first credible witnesses began documenting the extraordinary claims surrounding this mysterious nobleman. He did not merely suggest he possessed alchemical knowledge. He demonstrated it, performing transmutations before witnesses of unquestionable reputation. Giacomo Casanova, the famous Venetian adventurer, whose memoirs provide invaluable documentation of 18th century European society, encountered Saint Germain in 1757. Casanova was himself a sophisticated man of the world, familiar with the tricks of charlatans and confidence men who preyed upon the gullible nobility. Yet his account of Saint Germain reads with a mixture of fascination and unease that suggests genuine bewilderment. He described watching Saint Germain work with metals and gemstones, producing results that defied conventional explanation. More disturbing than these technical abilities was the man's conversation, which ranged across centuries with the casual intimacy of personal recollection. Saint Germain spoke of historical events not as a scholar reciting learned facts, but as someone describing memories. He discussed the wedding of Cana, where Christ supposedly turned water into wine, with the detailed recall of an eyewitness. He described the court of Francis I of France, who had ruled 2 centuries earlier, with specificity about personalities and private conversations that no historical text contained. When challenged on these apparent impossibilities, he would simply smile and change the subject, leaving his listeners unsettled and uncertain. Voltaire, the great French philosopher and perhaps the most penetrating intellect of his age, also wrote about Saint Germain. In his correspondence, Voltaire referred to the Count as a man who never dies and knows everything, a description laced with his characteristic irony, yet also carrying a note of genuine puzzlement. Voltaire was not a man easily impressed by mystical pretensions, having spent his career dismantling superstition and championing rational thought. That he found Saint Germain worthy of repeated mention suggests the Count represented something that could not be easily dismissed or explained. The specific claims surrounding Saint Germain's abilities centered on 3 main areas. First, he reportedly possessed the secret of transmuting base metals into gold, the classical goal of alchemy. Multiple witnesses claimed to have seen him perform such transmutations, though skeptics noted he never seemed interested in using this ability to amass wealth. Second, he demonstrated extraordinary skill with gemstones, allegedly removing flaws from diamonds and increasing their size through mysterious processes. He presented transformed gems to various nobles, and gemologists of the time reportedly confirmed the stones were genuine and of exceptional quality. Third, and most disturbing, he claimed to have discovered the elixir of life, the legendary substance that granted immortality or at least vastly extended youth. This final claim took various forms in different accounts. Sometimes he suggested he had lived for centuries, maintaining his vitality through the elixir's power. At other times, he implied he possessed the formula, but had not yet decided whether to use it, speaking of immortality as both a gift and a burden. He told some listeners he was 500 years old. He told others he was far older still, having witnessed events from ancient history. The consistency with which he maintained these impossible claims, never wavering or admitting to metaphor, created a deeply unsettling effect on those who spent time in his company. Perhaps the strangest detail, repeated across numerous independent sources, involved his relationship with food and drink. Multiple credible witnesses reported never seeing Saint Germain consume anything at social gatherings. In an era when elaborate dinners formed the centerpiece of aristocratic social life, he attended countless banquets and suppers, but apparently never ate or drank. Hostesses noted this peculiarity with confusion. Fellow guests found it disturbing. He would accept invitations to dinner, arrive punctually, and spend hours in animated conversation, but when dishes were served, he would simply sit with an empty plate before him, continuing to talk while everyone else ate. When questioned about this bizarre habit, he offered varying explanations. Sometimes he claimed to require only special preparations he made himself in his private laboratories. At other times, he suggested that his alchemical practices had transformed his physical nature, liberating him from ordinary human needs. The effect of watching him sit through multi-course banquets without consuming anything while discussing chemistry, history, and philosophy created an uncanny impression that lingered in witnesses' minds for years afterward. The Marquise de Pompadour, mistress of King Louis XV of France and one of the most powerful women in Europe, became fascinated by Saint Germain when he appeared at Versailles in 1748. She introduced him to the king, who granted him apartments in the palace and access to royal laboratories. Here, Saint Germain claimed to conduct alchemical experiments of the highest order, seeking to perfect the elixir and demonstrate the reality of metallic transmutation. The king, like many monarchs of his era, maintained a keen interest in alchemy, seeing it as both a potential source of wealth and a path to transcendent knowledge. During his time at Versailles, Saint Germain deepened his reputation for impossible knowledge. Courtiers reported conversations in which he described events from Louis XIV's reign, which had ended decades before, with the precision of someone who had been personally present. When reminded that he would have to be impossibly old to have witnessed these scenes, he would simply acknowledge the point with a mysterious smile and continue his account. The psychological impact of these performances was profound. Listeners found themselves suspended between rational disbelief and the disturbing evidence of their own senses. The 18th century's obsession with alchemy and immortality stemmed from deeper anxieties about change and mortality that the Enlightenment had intensified rather than resolved. As traditional religious certainties weakened among the educated classes, the fear of death became more acute. If this world was all that existed, if there was no heaven awaiting the faithful, then death represented absolute annihilation. Alchemy offered a materialist alternative to religious salvation, promising transformation and transcendence through knowledge rather than faith. The philosopher's stone and the elixir of life became secular substitutes for divine grace, and figures like Saint Germain embodied the tantalizing possibility that such salvation might actually be achievable. Whether Saint Germain consciously exploited these cultural anxieties or genuinely embodied them remains one of history's more intriguing questions. Skeptics have suggested he was simply a gifted con artist who recognized the era's preoccupations and crafted a persona designed to exploit them. He never asked for money, they note, but he gained access to the most exclusive circles of European power, enjoyed royal patronage, and lived in luxury. His demonstrations of alchemical ability, they argue, likely involved sophisticated tricks that impressed chemically naive aristocrats but would not have survived rigorous scientific scrutiny. Yet certain aspects of the Saint Germain story resist easy dismissal. The consistency of accounts across decades and multiple countries suggests something more complex than simple fraud. Witnesses of genuine intelligence and sophistication, people familiar with the tricks of charlatans, came away from encounters with him disturbed and uncertain. The details they recorded, particularly his disturbing refusal to eat or drink at social occasions, suggest a commitment to his mysterious persona that went far beyond what any rational con artist would maintain. What profit exists in such unsettling behavior? What advantage comes from making oneself an object of unease rather than simple admiration? As the 1750s progressed, Saint Germain's presence in European capitals became both more prominent and more controversial. He involved himself in diplomatic intrigues, claiming special knowledge of international affairs. He continued his alchemical demonstrations, always before credible witnesses, always producing results that seemed to exceed conventional explanation. And through it all, he maintained his impossible claims about his age, his knowledge, and his mastery of nature's deepest secrets. The man who never ate, who spoke of ancient history as personal memory, who transformed metals and gemstones before witnesses of impeccable reputation, had become a fixture of European high society. But questions multiplied around him like shadows. Who was he really? Where did his knowledge come from? And most disturbing of all, could his impossible claims possibly contain some kernel of truth that the rational mind struggled to accept? Orator. The smoke from 1,000 Paris chimneys mingled with the fog rolling off the Seine on a cold morning in 1760. In the ornate chambers of the French Foreign Ministry, diplomats gathered around a polished mala turntable, their faces drawn with concern. The subject of their emergency meeting was not a military defeat or a territorial dispute, but a single man who had vanished without explanation, leaving behind only questions and a trail of impossibilities that would haunt Europe's corridors of power for decades to come. The Comte de Saint-Germain had disappeared. For those who had worked alongside him during the intricate negotiations of the 7 Years' War, his absence created a void that went beyond mere inconvenience. It represented the loss of something they could barely articulate, a source of intelligence and insight that defied rational explanation. French Foreign Minister Étienne François de Choiseul stood at the window, staring out at the gray Parisian morning, and wondered aloud how one man could have known so much about so many things. How had the mysterious Count predicted the movements of Prussian forces with such accuracy? How had he possessed intimate knowledge of private conversations that took place behind locked doors in London, in Vienna, in St. Petersburg? The 7 Years' War had been a conflict of unprecedented scope, engulfing Europe, the Americas, and colonial territories across the globe. It was a war fought as much through espionage and diplomatic maneuvering as through battlefield strategy. And at the center of this shadowy world of intelligence gathering, the Comte de Saint-Germain had moved with an ease that suggested he was playing an entirely different game than everyone else. His role had begun innocuously enough in 1757, when he first appeared at the court of King Louis XV. The king, known for his elaborate spy networks and secret diplomatic channels, had taken an unusual interest in the enigmatic Count. Saint-Germain spoke at least a dozen languages fluently, including obscure dialects that scholars struggled to place. He demonstrated knowledge of chemical processes that alchemists guarded as closely held secrets. But most remarkably, he seemed to possess detailed intelligence about military and political developments across Europe before official dispatches arrived. Contemporary accounts from the period describe Saint-Germain attending a dinner party at the Palace of Versailles, where he casually mentioned troop movements near Prague, 2 days before French intelligence received confirmation of the same information through their established spy networks. The Duc de Choiseul, then ambassador to Rome, had written in his private diary that the Count spoke of negotiations in the Russian court with such specificity that he must have been present in the room, yet no travel records placed him anywhere near St. Petersburg during that time. The British had their own encounters with Saint-Germain during this period. Lord Holderness, the Secretary of State for the Northern Department, received reports from his agents in 1758 describing a mysterious French operative who seemed to appear simultaneously in multiple locations. One report placed Saint-Germain in London negotiating secretly with members of Parliament who favored a negotiated peace. Another, dated the same week, described him at a private gathering in The Hague, discussing Swedish naval capabilities with Dutch merchants. A third account had him in Berlin, somehow gaining access to Frederick the Great's inner circle despite being nominally aligned with France. What made these reports particularly unsettling was their consistency. Multiple independent sources described not just a skilled spy, but someone who operated with an almost supernatural efficiency. The Marquis de Voyer wrote to a fellow nobleman that Saint-Germain had warned him of a planned assassination attempt against a French diplomat in Vienna 3 weeks before it occurred, providing details about the conspirators that later proved accurate in every particular. When questioned about the source of his intelligence, Saint-Germain reportedly smiled and said only that he had learned of it long ago. The phrase "long ago" appeared repeatedly in accounts of Saint-Germain's conversations. Witnesses reported that he spoke of historical events not as facts learned from books, but as personal reminiscences. At a salon in Paris, he described the wedding of Anne of Austria to Louis XIII in 1615 with such vivid detail that one listener, the Countess de Georgy, remarked that he spoke as if he had attended the ceremony himself. When she laughed at this impossibility, Saint-Germain's expression, she later wrote, became distant and melancholy, as if he was remembering something painful from his own past. But it was during the complex diplomatic endgame of the 7 Years' War that Saint-Germain's activities became most mysterious and most troubling to those who observed them. In 1759 and 1760, He was involved in secret peace negotiations that ran parallel to official diplomatic channels. King Louis had given him some form of unofficial mandate to explore possibilities for ending the devastating conflict. Saint-Germain traveled constantly during these months, appearing in London one week, Amsterdam the next, then somehow back in Paris, with intelligence that should have taken weeks to gather. The British diplomat Horace Walpole encountered Saint-Germain in London during this period, and left a detailed account of their conversation. Walpole was struck by the Count's apparent knowledge of English court politics, including private conversations between the king and his ministers. Most disturbing to Walpole was Saint-Germain's prediction that certain political alliances would shift in specific ways, predictions that came true with eerie precision in the following months. Walpole wrote to a friend that speaking with the Count was like conversing with someone who had already lived through the events they were discussing, who knew how the story ended. The Russian dimension of Saint-Germain's wartime activities added another layer of mystery. Empress Elizabeth of Russia, a key player in the anti-Prussian alliance, apparently received several visits from the Count during the war years. Russian diplomatic correspondence, later discovered in the imperial archives, makes reference to a French envoy who possessed remarkable knowledge of conditions inside besieged Prussian territories. One letter from the Russian ambassador to France inquires delicately about this mysterious figure who seems to serve French interests while simultaneously maintaining connections in courts across Europe. But perhaps the most puzzling aspect of Saint-Germain's intelligence gathering was the quality of information he provided about matters that seemed to require physical presence to witness. He described the interior layout of buildings he had supposedly never entered. He knew the contents of private letters that had been delivered under seal. He predicted political decisions before the decision-makers themselves had reached their conclusions. Those who worked with him during this period privately wondered whether he had access to an impossible network of spies and informants, or whether something more inexplicable was at work. Then, in early 1760, the political situation in Paris turned against him. The exact circumstances remain murky, obscured by conflicting accounts and deliberately vague official records. What is known is that Saint-Germain became entangled in a power struggle between different factions at the French court. The Duc de Choiseul, who had initially worked with the Count, now viewed him as a threat to his own diplomatic authority. Accusations flew that Saint-Germain was playing a double game, perhaps even a triple game, serving interests beyond those of France. In the spring of 1760, the Count left Paris abruptly. Some accounts suggest he fled to avoid arrest. Others hint at a more complex arrangement, a staged departure designed to allow him to continue his work without official sanction. Whatever the truth, Saint-Germain vanished from the French capital as mysteriously as he had first appeared years earlier. Within months, rumors began circulating that he was dead. Some said he had died in poverty in London. Others claimed he had been assassinated by Prussian agents who feared his influence. The stories varied in their details, but they shared a common theme. The enigmatic Count was gone, his secrets buried with him. Then came the letters from St. Petersburg. In 1764, Russian court correspondents began making reference to a mysterious foreigner who had gained the favor of the newly crowned Empress Catherine II. He was described as a man of remarkable learning and refinement, a master of languages and sciences, someone who seemed to possess wisdom beyond his apparent years. The descriptions were vague at first, but gradually more details emerged. This mysterious figure at Catherine's court spoke fluent Russian with an archaic accent, demonstrated knowledge of Russian history that impressed the court historians, and offered political advice that suggested deep understanding of European affairs. By 1765, French diplomats in Russia were sending increasingly alarmed dispatches back to Paris. The man at Catherine's court, they reported with barely concealed astonishment, appeared to be none other than the Comte de Saint-Germain, supposedly dead for 5 years, now very much alive and apparently in excellent health. The Baron de Gleichen, a trusted diplomat, wrote a letter that captured the bewilderment of European officialdom confronting Saint-Germain's impossible reappearance. He described attending a reception at the Winter Palace, where he recognized the Count instantly, despite the years that had passed and the supposed death. When de Gleichen approached him, Saint-Germain greeted the diplomat warmly, as if their meeting was the most natural thing in the world. He made no attempt to explain his resurrection, offered no excuses or justifications. He simply was there, alive, unchanged, continuing whatever mysterious work had occupied him before his disappearance. Other witnesses reported similar encounters. A German prince wrote that Saint Germain looked not a day older than when they had last met in Paris 7 years earlier. An Austrian diplomat noted with unease that the Count spoke of recent European political developments with the same uncanny prescience he had displayed during the war. It was as if death itself had been merely another diplomatic posting, a temporary assignment from which he had now returned. The questions multiplied faster than answers. Had Saint Germain faked his death? If so, why? What had he been doing during those missing years? And perhaps most unsettling, if he could disappear and reappear at will, manipulating perception and records to create the illusion of death, what did that suggest about his earlier activities? Had the wartime intelligence that seemed impossibly comprehensive actually been gathered by a network of agents, or by a single individual who had somehow transcended the normal limitations of time and space? Speculation ran wild in the salons and chancelleries of Europe. Some whispered that Saint Germain must be using doubles, carefully trained agents who could impersonate him and maintain the illusion of his presence in multiple locations. Others suggested more fantastic explanations, drawing on the Count's own hints about his impossible age. Perhaps his wartime activities, his seeming omniscience, were not the product of an elaborate spy network, but of something far stranger, a single immortal individual who had been playing the long game in European politics for longer than anyone dared imagine. The implications were staggering. If Saint Germain had truly been alive for centuries, as he sometimes claimed, then his involvement in the 7 Years' War took on a different character entirely. He would not have been serving the interests of France or any other nation, but pursuing objectives that transcended the petty conflicts of mortal rulers. His impossible knowledge would not be the result of espionage, but of direct experience, of having witnessed and perhaps participated in the events and patterns that shaped European history. And his reappearance in Russia suggested something even more troubling, that whatever game he was playing was far from over. The man who could not die was still moving across the chessboard of European politics, his true motives as mysterious as his origins, his next move impossible to predict. In the candlelit rooms where diplomats gathered to parse the latest intelligence from St. Petersburg, they confronted a question that defied their training and experience. How do you negotiate with someone who might outlive your grandchildren? How do you plan against an opponent who might have been playing this game for centuries? The Comte de Saint-Germain had returned from the dead, and Europe's rulers discovered that immortality, if it existed, was the ultimate intelligence asset. Time itself had become a weapon in the hands of someone who might have conquered it. The death certificate sits in the church archives of Eckernförde, Germany, yellowed with age but perfectly legible. On February 27, 1784, a man identifying himself as Count Saint Germain died in this small northern town. The record-keeper's hand was steady that day. The ink didn't blot. There was nothing unusual about the entry, nothing to suggest that this death would become one of history's most disturbing mysteries. Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel maintained until his own death that he was there when Saint Germain passed. Charles was not some country fool or superstitious peasant. He was a military commander, a man of science, a prince of one of Europe's most powerful houses. He wrote in his personal correspondence that he had taken the Count into his residence at Louisenland Castle, that he had watched the mysterious nobleman decline over several weeks. Charles described how Saint Germain's breathing grew shallow, how his legendary vitality finally failed. The prince claimed he held vigil at the bedside, that he witnessed the final breath leave that enigmatic body. The burial followed quickly, as was customary. The Nikolaikirche recorded the interment. Local witnesses signed documents. Charles commissioned a modest memorial. Everything about the death was ordinary, documented, witnessed by credible sources. This was no shadowy disappearance, no convenient vanishing into legend. This was death with paperwork, death with aristocratic witnesses, death that followed every proper legal and religious protocol of the time. For most men, this is where the story ends. The final page of the ledger. The last shovelful of earth. But Count Saint-Germain had never been most men, and death, it seems, had no more power to hold him than time itself. Just 1 year after his documented death, In 1785, the Freemasons held their annual convention in Paris. These were not casual gatherings. The most powerful men in Europe attended. Detailed records were kept of every participant, every speech, every notable presence. Multiple witnesses, men whose reputations demanded accuracy, reported seeing Count Saint-Germain in attendance. Not a man who resembled him. Not someone claiming to be him. Count Saint-Germain himself, they insisted, moving through the crowds with that same preternatural grace, wearing clothes slightly out of fashion, speaking with that same accent that belonged to everywhere and nowhere. The secretary of the lodge recorded the sighting in the official minutes. He noted it as an oddity, a curiosity. How could this be, he wondered in his careful script, when the Count was known to have died in Germany the previous year? Some suggested it must be an impostor, someone trading on the famous name. But those who had known Saint-Germain personally insisted otherwise. They recognized not just his appearance, but his manner of speaking, his encyclopedic knowledge of obscure historical events, his ability to discuss alchemical formulas that only Saint-Germain had ever mastered. Most chilling of all, they noted that he looked exactly as he had when they first met him decades earlier. Not a year older. Not a day changed. This could be dismissed as mistaken identity, as wishful thinking from men who wanted to believe in mysteries. But the sightings didn't stop. They multiplied. They came from sources increasingly difficult to dismiss. In 1789, as France teetered on the edge of the abyss that would become the Revolution, Madame Adhémar held her position as lady-in-waiting to Queen Marie Antoinette. She was educated, skeptical, and placed at the very heart of power. She knew every courtier, every notable figure who moved through Versailles. In her personal memoirs, written years later, when she had nothing to gain from fabrication, she described an encounter that left her shaken for the rest of her life. She was walking through the gardens of the Tuileries when she saw a man she recognized immediately as Count Saint-Germain. She had met him years earlier at court functions. She remembered his face with perfect clarity, and now that same face appeared before her, unchanged by the passage of time. He approached her directly, called her by name, and spoke with urgent intensity about the coming catastrophe. France would burn, he told her. The Queen was in terrible danger. The old order would be swept away in blood. Madame Adhémar, despite her shock at seeing a dead man walking, despite the impossibility standing before her in afternoon sunlight, found herself believing him. His warning wasn't the vague prophecy of a charlatan. He described specific dangers, named individuals who would play crucial roles in the coming terror. He told her to warn the Queen, though he seemed to already know that his warnings would go unheeded. Then he left, disappearing into the afternoon crowds, leaving Madame Adhémar to wonder if she had witnessed a ghost, a vision, or something far stranger. She did try to warn Marie Antoinette. The Queen listened politely and dismissed the encounter as impossible. Count Saint-Germain was dead, she said. He had died 5 years earlier in Germany. Everyone knew this. The church records proved it. Prince Charles himself had confirmed it. But Madame Adhémar never wavered in her account. In her memoirs, even decades later, she maintained absolute certainty about what she had seen. She knew Count Saint-Germain. She had spoken with him. He was real, solid, as present as anyone she had ever met. And he looked exactly as he had appeared 20 years earlier when she first encountered him at Versailles. The revolution came exactly as the dead count had predicted. France drowned in blood. Marie Antoinette lost her head to the guillotine. Madame Adhémar fled into exile, carrying the memory of that impossible warning, that encounter with a man who should not exist. But Saint-Germain's post-mortem appearances weren't finished. The most disturbing sighting was yet to come. In 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte was dying on St. Helena, isolated on that barren rock in the South Atlantic, surrounded by British guards and fading glory. His personal valet, Louis Marchand, kept meticulous daily records of the emperor's final months. Everything was documented, from Napoleon's diet to his visitors, from his physical decline to his increasingly rare conversations. In these records, Marchand noted an unusual visitor, a man who gave no name but whom Napoleon greeted with shocked recognition. The accounts of this meeting are fragmentary, pieced together from Marchand's notes and later recollections from others in Napoleon's small household. But the consistent thread is this: Napoleon spoke with this mysterious visitor for nearly 3 hours behind closed doors. When the conversation ended, Napoleon emerged visibly shaken. He refused to identify his guest. He would only say that he had consulted with someone who understood the patterns of history, someone who had watched empires rise and fall, someone whose perspective spanned generations. Years later, Marchand confided to a friend that he believed the visitor was Count Saint Germain. He claimed that as the man departed, he caught a glimpse of his face. Marchand had seen portraits of Saint Germain, had heard the stories. The resemblance was too specific to be coincidence, but this was 1821, 37 years after the Count's recorded death. The man Marchand saw should have been ancient if he were truly Saint Germain. Instead, he appeared to be in his mid-40s, precisely the age Saint Germain had seemed to maintain throughout the previous century. What did Napoleon and this visitor discuss? What wisdom or warnings passed between them? We will never know. Napoleon died weeks later, taking the secret with him. But the pattern was now undeniable. Count Saint Germain, officially dead and buried in 1784, kept appearing to crucial witnesses at pivotal moments in history, always looking exactly as he had decades earlier, always seeming to possess knowledge that spanned far beyond a normal human lifetime. The implications are genuinely horrifying, not in the simple sense of fear, but in the deeper sense of reality breaking down. Either Count Saint Germain staged his death, which means he fooled a prince, deceived church officials, falsified documents, and created an elaborate charade for reasons we cannot fathom. Or death itself didn't apply to him, which means everything we understand about human existence, about mortality, about the fundamental rules that govern life, might be wrong. Consider what staging his death would require. Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel would need to be either fooled or complicit. Church officials would need to be bribed or deceived. A body would need to be produced, buried, recorded in official documents. The conspiracy would need to remain absolutely secret, with no witnesses breaking their silence, no documentation surviving to reveal the truth. Saint Germain would need to have motivations so compelling that he would abandon his identity, his reputation, his accumulated wealth and connections, all to convince the world he was dead. But why? What possible reason could justify such an elaborate deception? If Saint Germain wanted to disappear, he could have simply left. He had done it before, vanishing from one country to appear in another, changing names and identities as easily as other men changed clothes. Why create a documented death? Why involve a prince as a witness? Why make it official? Unless the death was necessary for something else. Unless becoming officially dead freed him to operate in ways that a living identity could not. Unless he needed the world to believe he was gone so he could continue his work, whatever that work truly was, without the constant scrutiny that had followed him for decades. The alternative is somehow worse. If Saint Germain didn't stage his death, if he genuinely died in 1784, and then continued to appear afterward, then we are facing something that violates every natural law. Death is supposed to be final. It's the one absolute certainty, the boundary that cannot be crossed. But Saint Germain crossed it, or never reached it, or existed somehow outside its jurisdiction. The witnesses cannot all be wrong. They cannot all be lying. Madame Adhémar had no reason to fabricate her encounter. She wrote her memoirs years after the Revolution, when the mysteries of Count Saint Germain were largely forgotten by the wider world. She gained nothing from claiming she had seen him. The Freemason secretaries who recorded his presence at their convention were documenting their official minutes, not writing fiction. Louis Marchand kept private notes, never intended for publication, describing Napoleon's mysterious visitor. These were credible people, separated by years and geography, none of them collaborating, none of them benefiting from their claims. Yet they all reported the same impossible thing. They saw Count Saint Germain after his documented death, and each time he looked exactly as he had appeared 50 years earlier. Not aged, not changed, frozen in time or existing outside of it entirely. The church records still exist in Eckernförde. You can visit the archives, request to see the death certificate. It's real. The ink is genuine 18th century composition. The paper is correct for the period. The handwriting matches other documents from the same church official. There is no evidence of forgery, no indication of deception. As far as any historical analysis can determine, Count Saint-Germain died on February 27, 1784, and was properly buried. Yet the sightings continued. Into the 19th century, into the 20th, reports kept surfacing. Always the same description. Always the same ageless face. Always that sense of timeless knowledge, of perspective that spanned centuries. Each sighting is less documented, less credible, easier to dismiss. But the pattern never changes. Somewhere, witnesses claim Count Saint-Germain still walks, still appears at crucial moments, still looks exactly as he did in the court of Louis XV. Perhaps he found the secret that alchemists sought for centuries. Perhaps he discovered how to step outside of time, to cheat death, to exist in the margins between moments. Or perhaps death came for him in Eckernförde as it comes for everyone, and what continues is something else entirely. An echo, a remnant, a presence that refuses to acknowledge its own ending. The grave in Eckernförde has never been exhumed. No one has ever verified that a body lies beneath that memorial. And perhaps that's for the best. Because if the grave is empty, we would have to accept that death was staged. And if the grave is occupied, we would have to accept something worse. That death doesn't always mean the end. That for some people, for reasons we cannot understand, the rules simply don't apply. The gaslights flickered along the streets of London in 1891, when Annie Besant first encountered the man who would change her understanding of reality forever. She had been walking through a fog-shrouded alley near the British Museum, her mind heavy with questions about the nature of consciousness and human potential, when she noticed him standing beneath a street lamp. He wore clothes that seemed somehow out of place, formal, yet antiquated in a way she couldn't quite articulate. His eyes held a depth that reminded her of ancient wells. When he spoke to her, addressing her by name, though they had never met, his voice carried an accent she could not identify. Something European, but impossible to pin down to any particular country or era. He spoke to her of things to come, of the great war that would soon engulf Europe, of humanity's spiritual evolution, and of her role in guiding seekers toward enlightenment. Then, as a carriage passed between them, he simply vanished, leaving behind only the faint scent of violets and the unmistakable certainty that she had encountered something far beyond ordinary human experience. This was not an isolated incident. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, dozens of members of the Theosophical Society reported similar encounters with a mysterious figure matching the historical descriptions of the Comte de Saint-Germain. But by this time, the enigmatic aristocrat who had dazzled the courts of Europe in the 1700s had transformed into something far stranger and more unsettling. He had become, in the teachings of Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, one of the ascended masters, immortal beings who guided humanity's spiritual evolution from hidden sanctuaries in Tibet and other remote corners of the world. Blavatsky herself claimed regular contact with Saint-Germain, insisting that he was one of her primary spiritual teachers, communicating with her through astral projection and occasionally manifesting in physical form. In her massive work, The Secret Doctrine, published in 1888, she positioned Saint-Germain as a key figure in a hidden spiritual hierarchy, a being who had transcended the normal cycle of death and rebirth to become a guardian of esoteric wisdom. According to Blavatsky's teachings, Saint-Germain had lived for centuries, perhaps millennia, accumulating knowledge and spiritual power until he had achieved what the Theosophists called ascension. He was now, she claimed, working tirelessly behind the scenes of human history, appearing at crucial moments to nudge civilization toward enlightenment. What made these claims particularly compelling was the sheer number of seemingly credible witnesses who reported encounters with him. These were not uneducated peasants or attention-seeking frauds, but educated members of society, writers, philosophers, and social reformers. They described meetings that shared uncanny similarities, despite occurring years apart and in different countries. The man always appeared unexpectedly. He always demonstrated impossible knowledge of private matters. He always spoke of future events with disturbing accuracy. And he always disappeared without explanation, leaving no trace of his presence beyond the profound impact on those who met him. C.W. Leadbeater, a prominent theosophist and close associate of Besant, documented his own encounter with Saint Germain in Rome during the summer of 1906. Leadbeater was a former Anglican priest who had abandoned conventional religion for Theosophy's promise of direct spiritual experience. He claimed that while visiting the Colosseum at twilight, contemplating the rise and fall of civilizations, a distinguished gentleman approached him and began speaking about the Roman Empire with a familiarity that suggested first-hand knowledge. When Leadbeater questioned how the man knew such intimate details about events from nearly 2,000 years earlier, the stranger smiled and replied that he had been there. The conversation continued for hours, ranging across topics from ancient mystery schools to the future of European politics. The man spoke of coming upheavals, of empires that would crumble, of the spiritual awakening that would follow great suffering. When Leadbeater asked his name, the man simply said that Leadbeater already knew it. Looking into his eyes, Leadbeater claimed he recognized the consciousness he had felt during his meditative contacts with Saint Germain. When he turned to call for his companion to witness this extraordinary meeting, the man had vanished completely, impossible in the open space of the ancient amphitheater where no exits were nearby. The pattern continued through the turbulent decades of the early 20th century. In 1913, just months before the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand would trigger the First World War, a theosophist named Dion Fortune reported an encounter in a London bookshop. A man browsing the occult section struck up a conversation about the coming darkness and the necessity of preserving esoteric knowledge through the chaos ahead. He recommended specific texts for her to study and suggested she would play a role in maintaining magical traditions through the dark times approaching. When she returned to the shop the following week to thank him, the proprietor insisted no such person had been there. The books he had recommended, however, were waiting on the counter, purchased and left in her name. During the war itself, as Europe tore itself apart and millions died in the trenches, reports of Saint Germain sightings intensified. Soldiers on leave spoke of a mysterious officer who appeared in cafes behind the lines, always alone, always distinguished, speaking words of encouragement and prophecy before disappearing. Theosophists working in field hospitals claimed he visited wounded men, offering comfort and occasionally, inexplicably, healing. A French nurse named Marie Descours documented an incident in 1917 where a man matching Saint Germain's description appeared at her hospital near Verdun. He moved among the dying, speaking to them in their native languages, regardless of nationality. She watched him spend an hour with a German soldier who had been screaming in agony, unable to be calmed by morphine. After the mysterious visitor left, the soldier died peacefully, a smile on his face. When Descours asked him what the man had said, the soldier, with his last breath, whispered that he had been shown what comes after, and it was beautiful. The visitor had left no record of entry, signed no logs, and none of the other staff remembered admitting him. Between the wars, as Theosophy flourished and spawned numerous offshoot movements, the accounts multiplied. The pattern remained consistent and unsettling. Saint Germain appeared during moments of historical crisis or personal transformation. He always seemed to possess impossible knowledge. He provided guidance that often proved prophetic, and he never stayed long enough to be properly questioned or investigated. Guy Ballard, an American mining engineer, claimed the most extensive modern contact with Saint Germain. In 1930, while hiking on Mount Shasta in California, Ballard said he encountered a young man who materialized near a mountain spring. This figure revealed himself as Saint Germain and proceeded to instruct Ballard in metaphysical principles over a series of meetings. These encounters formed the basis of the I Am activity, a new religious movement that explicitly worshipped the ascended masters, with Saint Germain as the central figure. Ballard's wife and son both claimed their own meetings with Saint Germain, describing him as appearing sometimes young, sometimes old, able to change his appearance at will. Critics dismissed the Ballards as charlatans, yet thousands of followers insisted they too had felt Saint Germain's presence during I Am gatherings, seen his form manifesting in shimmering light, heard his voice speaking directly to their mind. But here is where the story becomes truly unsettling. What if these weren't delusions or frauds? What if someone deliberately cultivated this mystical persona, understanding that the best way to hide might be in plain sight, wrapped in claims so extraordinary that rational minds would automatically dismiss them. Consider the strategic brilliance of such an approach. By allowing himself to be proclaimed an immortal ascended master, any actual physical appearances could be explained away by skeptics as misidentification or wishful thinking. He could move freely through spiritualist circles, gathering intelligence, influencing key figures, shaping movements, all while protected by the very implausibility of his supposed nature. Look at the timing of his appearances. Saint Germain resurfaces in theosophical accounts, precisely when Europe stands on the brink of massive transformation. The 1870s and 80s, when Blavatsky founded her society, were decades of colonial expansion, technological revolution, and the birth of modern occultism as a response to materialist science. The years before World War I, when sightings intensified, represented the death throes of the old European order. The interwar period, when theosophy reached its peak influence, was a time of desperate seeking as people tried to make sense of unprecedented slaughter and looked toward alternative spiritualities. Someone with resources, connections, and a very long view of history could use the theosophical movement as a perfect cover. The society attracted intellectuals, social reformers, artists, and political figures. It had chapters worldwide. It facilitated private meetings in remote locations. Members were predisposed to accept extraordinary claims and maintain secrecy about spiritual experiences. An individual who understood group psychology could appear to select members, deliver carefully crafted messages, and disappear, knowing the witnesses would interpret the encounter through an occult framework that actually provided him protection from serious investigation. The accounts from credible witnesses are too numerous and too consistent to simply dismiss. Annie Besant was a brilliant social reformer and women's rights advocate, not a fool. Leadbeater, whatever his later controversies, was an educated and intelligent observer. These were people capable of distinguishing between imagination and physical reality. They reported specific details, conversations, physical characteristics. They described a man, not a vision, not a ghost, but a flesh and blood person who nevertheless did impossible things and vanished inexplicably. Perhaps the truth lies in a disturbing middle ground. Perhaps someone, possibly the same individual or family line that created the Saint Germain legend in the 18th century, recognized the power of mysticism as camouflage. By encouraging theosophists to see him as an ascended master, by carefully staging encounters that reinforced supernatural interpretations, by ensuring he always disappeared in ways that seemed miraculous, he created a situation where his actual activities would be ignored in favor of spiritual speculation. Who would believe a theosophist claiming Saint Germain told them about political developments in Tibet or secret societies in Europe? The occult framing discredited the information even as it was being delivered. The last major wave of sightings occurred in the 1930s and early 40s, as Europe descended into fascism and a second global war loomed. Theosophists reported Saint Germain appearing with increasing urgency, warning of the darkness ahead, instructing followers to preserve knowledge and maintain spiritual centers that could serve as lights during the coming storm. Then, as the war consumed everything, the sightings stopped. After 1945, Saint Germain's physical manifestations became rare, relegated to vague spiritual contacts, and channeled messages rather than the face-to-face encounters that had characterized earlier decades. Had he achieved what he needed? Had the chaos of 2 world wars and the complete transformation of European society accomplished some goal that required centuries of patient work? Or had he simply grown old and died, the last in a line of individuals who had maintained this extraordinary deception across generations? We are left with hundreds of documented accounts, multiple credible witnesses, and a pattern too consistent to easily explain away, yet too extraordinary for conventional history to accept. The man who may have been Saint Germain used the mystical movements of his era the same way he once used aristocratic courts, as a stage for a performance whose true purpose remains hidden. The spotlight of supernatural belief proved to be the perfect darkness in which to operate unseen. Photograph first surfaced in 1973, though the negative was dated December of '72. A street photographer in Paris working the cafes along Boulevard Saint-Germain had captured something he couldn't explain. Among his contact sheets from that cold winter month was an image that would later circulate through private collectors and paranormal researchers with an intensity bordering on obsession. The photograph showed a man in his mid-40s, seated alone at a corner table of Café de Flore, a demitasse of espresso untouched before him. He wore a dark turtleneck and blazer, unremarkable for the Iriot. His posture was rigid, almost aristocratic. His hands rested on the marble tabletop with the careful placement of someone accustomed to being painted. But it was his face that created the disturbance. When researchers later compared this photograph to 18th century portraits attributed to the Comte de Saint-Germain, the similarities defied comfortable explanation. The photographer, whose name was Jean-Marc Belvoir, gave several interviews before his death in 1998. His account never varied. He had been working his usual circuit that afternoon, taking candid shots of café patrons for a project documenting Parisian street life. The man at the corner table had caught his attention because of his stillness. In the constant motion of the café, this figure sat motionless, staring at nothing, or perhaps at something no one else could see. Belvoir approached and asked permission to take his photograph. The man's response was what Belvoir remembered most vividly. He spoke French, but not contemporary French. The accent and phrasing belonged to another century entirely. Belvoir, who had studied literature at the Sorbonne, recognized elements of pre-revolutionary speech patterns, the formal second-person forms that had fallen out of common use, vocabulary that felt archaic but precisely deployed. The man gave his consent with a slight inclination of his head. Belvoir took 3 photographs in quick succession. When he lowered his camera, he engaged the subject in conversation, partly from curiosity, partly from the unsettling quality of the encounter. The man spoke about Paris with intimate familiarity, but the Paris he described no longer existed. He referenced streets that had been demolished during Haussmann's renovation of the city in the 1860s. He described buildings in exact detail that had been torn down a century before. When Belvoir mentioned the Rue de Rivoli, the man smiled slightly and commented on how the street had changed since its creation, as if he had witnessed its construction under Napoleon. Most disturbing was his description of a particular brothel that had operated near the Palais Royal in the 1770s. He provided the name of the establishment, the appearance of its entrance, even the name of the woman who had operated it. Weeks later, driven by persistent unease, Belvoir researched these details in historical archives. Every element the man had mentioned was accurate, documented in obscure police records and private journals from the period. This was not information available in any general history book. This was knowledge that required either extensive historical research or direct experience. When forensic analysis began on the photograph years later, the findings created more questions than answers. In 1987, a team at the Sorbonne examined the negative using techniques developed for authenticating historical photographs. They confirmed the negative dated to 1972 based on the film stock and chemical composition. No evidence of manipulation or double exposure appeared. The image was genuine, taken when and where Belvoir claimed. The next phase involved facial comparison analysis, primitive by today's standards, but rigorous for its time. Researchers obtained high-resolution copies of 3 portraits attributed to the Comte de Saint-Germain from the 1700s. One hung in a private collection in Vienna. Another belonged to a museum in Bavaria. The third came from the archives of a French noble family. The comparison focused on bone structure, the spacing of facial features, the proportions that remain constant regardless of age or expression, the distance between the pupils, the angle of the jaw, the placement of the cheekbones relative to the eye sockets. In all measurable parameters, the man in the 1972 photograph matched the portraits with a statistical probability that made the researchers deeply uncomfortable. One analysis suggested a 92% likelihood that the photographs depicted the same individual, but this conclusion was impossible. The portraits were nearly 200 years old. The researchers issued their report with careful language about doppelgangers and statistical anomalies, but privately, several admitted the results disturbed them profoundly. The photograph might have remained a curious anomaly if not for what emerged in the following decade. Throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, reports began accumulating from exclusive circles in Switzerland and France. Attendees at private gatherings, diplomatic receptions, and invitation-only salons reported encounters with a man who introduced himself as the Comte de Saint-Germain. These were not occultists or spiritual seekers, but business people, academics, minor nobility, individuals with reputations to protect. Yet their accounts shared remarkable consistency. A Swiss banker described meeting him at a private reception in Geneva in 1976. The man discussed European monetary policy with expertise that suggested direct experience with historical economic crises. He referenced the South Sea bubble of 1720 as if he had witnessed its collapse. He spoke about the formation of the Bank of England with the casual familiarity of someone who had observed it firsthand. When pressed about his age, he deflected with humor, but his knowledge was undeniable. A French academic encountered him at a chateau in the Loire Valley in 1979. The gathering focused on 18th century music, and this man performed a piece on harpsichord he claimed to have composed himself. The academic, a musicologist specializing in the Baroque period, recognized the style as authentic to the 1700s. When she asked where he had found the manuscript, he smiled and said he had never written it down, that he simply remembered it. Later research revealed that a composition matching the piece he played had been attributed to Saint-Germain in historical records, but no known score existed. How had he reproduced it so precisely? The descriptions of his appearance were most troubling. Every witness remarked on his agelessness. Not youthfulness, but a quality of existing outside normal temporal markers. His face showed no lines of age, yet suggested enormous experience. His manner belonged to another era, yet he navigated contemporary society with ease. He spoke modern languages fluently, but with subtle archaic elements that suggested he had learned them long ago and never quite updated his usage. Then came Richard Chanfray, and the entire phenomenon took on a theatrical, almost grotesque dimension. In 1972, the same year as the café photograph, a French entertainer and sometime alchemist appeared on national television claiming to be the Comte de Saint-Germain. Chanfray was charismatic, educated, and utterly convincing in his presentation. He had been involved in French high society, romantically linked to the actress Dalida, moving through circles of wealth and influence with ease. His television appearance was meant to promote a book, but what happened during the broadcast exceeded publicity. Chanfray demonstrated what he claimed was alchemical transformation. Under the scrutiny of cameras and in the presence of witnesses, he appeared to transmute lead into gold. The demonstration was filmed, recorded, witnessed by multiple people. Skeptics immediately cried fraud, claiming sleight of hand or prearranged props. Yet the broadcast created a sensation. Chanfray provided details about historical events, about life at Versailles, about the court of Louis XV, with a specificity that seemed to exceed research or preparation. He claimed to possess the secret of the philosopher's stone. He spoke about his life spanning centuries with the calm assurance of someone stating mundane facts. When interviewers challenged him, he responded not with defensiveness, but with a kind of weary patience, as if explaining obvious truths to children. Some who watched found him delusional. Others found him terrifying in his conviction. For a decade, Chanfray occupied a strange space in French cultural consciousness. Too famous to ignore, too bizarre to fully accept. He gave occasional interviews, made rare public appearances, always maintaining his claim. Then, in 1983, he and Dalida traveled to Corsica. On the night of July 11th, in a house in Saint Maxime, Richard Chanfray died. The official cause was suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning. He was found in a car with the engine running in a closed garage. Dalida discovered his body. The death was ruled self-inflicted. The man who claimed immortality had apparently chosen to end his life. Except that wasn't the end of the story. Within months of his death, reports surfaced of sightings. A man matching Chanfray's description at a private gathering in Monaco. Another sighting in Paris, at a restaurant Chanfray had frequented. These could easily be dismissed as mistaken identity, the kind of phantom sightings that follow any public figure's death. But the reports continued, and they came from people who had known Chanfray personally. A former associate claimed to have had a conversation with him in Zurich in 1985, 2 years after his supposed death. The man had acknowledged being Chanfray, smiled at the confusion, and walked away. The disturbing question became whether Chanfrey had genuinely believed he was Saint Germain, whether he was a skilled con artist, or whether something far stranger was at work. Had he faked his death to escape the burden of his claims? Or was the death itself genuine, and the subsequent sightings the result of collective delusion or deliberate hoaxes? The Paris Café photograph gained renewed attention. Researchers compared images of Chanfrey to the man in the 1972 photograph. The dates aligned. The television appearance and the café photograph occurred within weeks of each other. But the facial features, while similar, weren't identical. Either there were two men claiming to be Saint Germain in Paris simultaneously, or something more complex was occurring. What creates such profound unease about these modern accounts is their proximity to our own time. We can dismiss 18th century reports as exaggeration or myth, but 1972 exists within living memory. The photograph can be analyzed with modern forensic techniques. Television footage of Chanfrey's demonstration can be reviewed frame by frame. Living witnesses can still provide testimony. The evidence remains tantalizingly close to verification, yet always just beyond definitive proof. The phenomenon taps into a fundamental human anxiety about the nature of identity and time. We construct our reality on the assumption that people age and die, that history moves forward, that the past remains fixed and inaccessible. The possibility of someone moving through centuries, unchanged and unchanging, violates these foundational beliefs. It suggests that time might not operate as we assume, that human consciousness might not be bound by the limits we accept as absolute. Whether the Comte de Saint-Germain was a real immortal, a succession of impersonators, or a persistent collective hallucination, the modern evidence forces us to confront uncomfortable possibilities. The café photograph exists. The forensic analysis produced results that defy easy explanation. Chanfrey's television appearance is documented fact. The witness testimonies come from credible sources with nothing obvious to gain from fabrication. We are left with evidence that refuses to resolve cleanly into either proof or debunking. And perhaps that irresolution is the true source of the fear these accounts provoke. We want certainty. We want the mystery solved, the phenomenon explained, the anomaly contained within rational categories. Instead, we're given fragments that suggest something impossible might be true, or that something equally disturbing about human perception and belief might be at work. Either possibility unsettles the foundations of what we think we know. And in that uncertainty, in that space between the possible and the impossible, the Count de Saint-Germain continues to exist, watching us from across centuries with those knowing, ageless eyes. In the shadowy corners of historical record, where documentation meets mystery and fact, leads into legend, there exists a pattern so disturbing that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The pattern suggests something that should be impossible, something that violates every natural law we hold sacred. It whispers of a single man who has walked through centuries, wearing different faces, speaking different names, yet always leaving the same unmistakable signature. His most famous name is the Count of Saint-Germain, but that identity was merely one mask among many. The question that haunts researchers who dare to look too closely is not whether he existed, but how many times he has existed, and under how many names. Begin with what we know for certain. In the mid-1700s, European courts buzzed with tales of an enigmatic nobleman who claimed to be centuries old. The Count of Saint-Germain dazzled aristocrats with demonstrations of alchemical knowledge that seemed beyond his time. He spoke dozens of languages with native fluency, including ancient dialects that no living scholar should have mastered. He displayed intimate knowledge of events from centuries past, not as a historian recounts them, but as an eyewitness would remember them. When pressed about his age, he did not deflect. He stated plainly that he had lived for thousands of years. Most dismissed this as the eccentric boasting of a clever charlatan, but those who spent significant time in his presence grew unsettled. There was something in the way he spoke of ancient Rome, of medieval courts, of long-dead monarchs, that rang with the terrible authenticity of lived experience. Then, in 1784, he reportedly died in Germany. His body was examined. A death certificate was issued. The matter should have been closed. But here is where the pattern begins to reveal itself. Rewind 2 centuries earlier to 1545. In Prague, the court physician to Emperor Rudolf II was a mysterious figure named Trithemius. Historical records show this man possessed alchemical knowledge that confounded his contemporaries. He claimed to have discovered the secrets of transmutation and longevity. He spoke of events from the distant past with suspicious precision. He moved through royal courts with inexplicable influence, whispering in the ears of kings. And then, like Saint Germain after him, he vanished from record, his death unverified, his fate unknown. The similarities are noteworthy, but perhaps coincidental. Go back further. In the 14th century, Paris was home to a humble scribe named Nicolas Flamel. Historical documents confirm his existence beyond doubt. He was a real man, married to a woman named Perenelle, living an unremarkable life. Until, according to records, something changed. Flamel suddenly displayed vast wealth of unknown origin. He funded hospitals and churches, yet his profession as a scribe could not account for such riches. Contemporary accounts describe Flamel claiming he had mastered the philosopher's stone, achieving both the transmutation of base metals into gold and the creation of the elixir of life. He wrote manuscripts detailing alchemical processes that scholars still cannot fully decipher. His writings demonstrate knowledge that seemed to transcend the scientific understanding of his era. Nicolas Flamel officially died in 1418. His grave exists. Researchers can visit it today. Except in 1661, over 2 centuries after his supposed death, multiple witnesses reported seeing Nicolas Flamel alive and well at an alchemical gathering in Paris. The man they described matched every known detail of Flamel's appearance. He spoke of events from the 14th century with intimate knowledge. When confronted about his identity, he smiled and vanished into the crowd. The witness testimonies are preserved in the archives of the Bibliothèque Nationale. They are not folklore. They are sworn statements from credible observers. But the pattern stretches back even further, into eras where documentation becomes sparse, but whispers persist. In ancient Rome, during the reign of Emperor Tiberius, court records mention a mysterious advisor named Apollonius of Tyana. This figure traveled extensively, speaking numerous languages, demonstrating knowledge of sciences and philosophies that astounded Roman scholars. He claimed to have visited India and learned secret wisdom from ancient masters. He performed what witnesses described as miraculous feats. He spoke of extending human life indefinitely through mastery of natural laws. Apollonius reportedly died in the year 98 of the Common Era. Yet Christian scholars writing 2 centuries later describe encountering a man matching his description who claimed to be Apollonius himself, unchanged by time. The accounts exist in fragmentary texts, dismissed by mainstream historians as legend. But the details are precise. The knowledge attributed to this figure matches too closely with later claimants to immortality. Now consider Christian Rosenkreuz, the mythical founder of the Rosicrucian order. According to foundational Rosicrucian texts published in the early 1600s, Rosenkreuz was born in 1378. He traveled to the Middle East as a young man, where he learned alchemical secrets from Arabian masters. He returned to Europe and founded a secret brotherhood dedicated to hidden wisdom and the transformation of humanity. The texts claim that Rosenkreuz lived to be 106 years old, dying in 1484. His body was placed in a sealed tomb, preserved by alchemical means. Here is where it becomes unsettling. In 1614, exactly 120 years after his burial, members of the Rosicrucian order claimed to have opened his tomb. They reported finding his body perfectly preserved, unchanged by decay. Surrounding him were manuscripts containing alchemical formulas and prophecies about future events that later came to pass with disturbing accuracy. Whether Christian Rosenkreuz was a real person remains disputed, but the knowledge contained in Rosicrucian texts demonstrates mastery of alchemical principles that parallel exactly what Saint Germain would later display. The philosophical frameworks are identical. The approach to transmutation follows the same precise steps. The language used to describe the great work matches almost word for word. Either the Rosicrucians preserved and transmitted the knowledge of their founder across generations, or the founder himself preserved himself. Then there is Francis Bacon, the English philosopher and statesman who lived from 1561 to 1626. Bacon was undeniably real, a towering figure in the development of the scientific method. His documented achievements are remarkable enough, but examine the edges of his life, the details that historians gloss over, and a familiar pattern emerges. Bacon wrote extensively about extending human life through what he called experimental philosophy. His essay on the prolongation of life outlined specific techniques for retarding aging, techniques that mirror alchemical practices described by Flamel and others. He possessed knowledge of codes and ciphers that some researchers believe hide deeper meanings in his published works. Contemporary accounts describe Bacon conducting secretive experiments in isolated locations. Witnesses reported strange lights and unusual sounds emanating from his laboratories. He was known to disappear for extended periods without explanation. Francis Bacon's official death in 1626 was attributed to pneumonia contracted while conducting an experiment with freezing a chicken in snow. The story has a convenient absurdity to it. His burial was rushed. Multiple scholars of the era questioned whether he truly died or staged his death to continue his work in secrecy. In the decades following Bacon's supposed death, travelers across Europe reported encounters with a mysterious Englishman of noble bearing who demonstrated intimate knowledge of Bacon's unpublished work and spoke of the scientific method as if he had invented it himself. Coincidence piled upon coincidence begins to look like something else. Consider the common threads that weave through these supposedly separate lives. Each figure possessed alchemical knowledge far beyond their contemporaries. Each claimed or was credited with discovering methods to extend life indefinitely. Each had mysterious periods of absence in their documented history. Each demonstrated fluency in multiple languages and deep knowledge of ancient cultures. Each had connections to secret societies or esoteric orders. Each appeared to possess wealth from unexplained sources. And critically, each had a death that was either unverified, suspicious in its circumstances, or later contradicted by credible witness testimony. The implications crystallize like ice in the blood. What if these were not separate individuals? What if the same consciousness, the same ancient being, simply moved through history wearing different identities like clothing? It would explain so much. The consistent knowledge base across centuries. The identical alchemical formulas appearing in texts separated by hundreds of years. The way each figure seemed to possess wisdom that transcended their era. The mysterious disappearances and questionable deaths. If one man discovered the secret of immortality in ancient times, perhaps in Egypt or Babylon, where alchemical traditions originated, how would he survive through the ages? He could not maintain the same identity indefinitely without raising questions. People would notice that he did not age. Suspicions would grow dangerous. So he would die, officially. He would stage an ending to one identity, then resurface decades later in a different location, under a different name, appearing to be the appropriate age for his new persona. He would carry his knowledge with him, carefully revealing it in measured doses, shaping human development from the shadows. Think of the influence such a being could accumulate. Living for centuries, he would witness the rise and fall of empires. He would learn to read the patterns of power, to position himself near kings and emperors. A whisper in the right ear, at the right moment, could redirect the course of nations. An alchemical formula shared with the right scholar could accelerate scientific advancement by decades. He would not rule openly. That would invite too much scrutiny. Instead, he would advise, suggest, guide. He would plant seeds of ideas and watch them grow across generations. He would appear during pivotal moments in history, offering knowledge precisely calibrated to push humanity in directions only he could foresee. The historical record, when examined through this lens, reveals gaps and anomalies that suddenly make terrible sense. The missing years in the lives of influential figures. The unexplained sources of knowledge that sparked scientific revolutions. The secret societies that appeared at crucial moments with wisdom that seemed to come from nowhere. The suspiciously similar alchemical texts appearing across centuries and continents. Some researchers who have pursued this pattern too deeply report experiencing disturbing synchronicities. They find their work interrupted by mysterious illnesses. Their sources dry up without explanation. Documents they plan to examine vanish from archives. They begin to feel watched. One researcher, documenting connections between Saint Germain and earlier historical figures in the 1970s, abandoned her work abruptly. She left academia entirely and refused to discuss her findings. Years later, shortly before her death, she told a colleague that she had found proof, irrefutable documentary evidence linking at least 6 historical identities to a single individual. She claimed she was warned to stop looking. When pressed about who warned her, she would only say that some patterns are meant to remain hidden, and some questions should never be answered. If the pattern is real, if one immortal has indeed walked through millennia wearing different faces, then we must confront a chilling question. How many other identities has he worn that we have not yet identified? How many pivotal moments in history bore his invisible fingerprints? How many world-changing ideas were his whispers, planted in receptive minds? And most disturbing of all, if he existed in the 1700s as Saint Germain, staged his death, and followed the pattern that had sustained him for centuries, then where is he now? What name does he wear? What institutions does he influence? Is he watching still, guiding humanity towards some incomprehensible goal that only an immortal perspective could envision? The silence of history offers no comfort. Only the pattern remains, stretching back through the centuries like a shadow that never fades. The question refuses to die. 3 centuries of investigation, countless theories, reams of documentation, and still we stand at the edge of the same precipice, staring into darkness that stares back. The Comte de Saint-Germain remains unexplained, and perhaps that is precisely what terrifies us most. Consider what persists across the ages. From the salons of 1743 Paris to the court of Catherine the Great, from revolutionary France to Victorian London, the descriptions never waver. A man of middling height, dark hair, penetrating eyes that seem to hold centuries, a face that appears neither young nor old, frozen somewhere in his 40s. Always impeccably dressed, always courteous, always slightly apart from the crowd, as if observing rather than participating. Consistency is unnerving. Eyewitnesses separated by decades, by hundreds of miles, by different social circles and languages, all describe the same man. The knowledge he possessed compounds the mystery. He spoke flawlessly in at least 12 languages, switching between them with native fluency. He demonstrated expertise in chemistry that would not be formalized for another century. He discussed historical events with the intimate detail of someone who had been present, not someone who had read about them in books. When challenged about his age, he did not laugh it off or deflect. He simply smiled and confirmed what seemed impossible, offering anecdotes from meetings with figures long dead, describing their mannerisms, their private conversations, their secrets that history had forgotten. The witnesses cannot be dismissed. These were not hysterical peasants seeing ghosts in the mist. Voltaire, one of the greatest minds of the Enlightenment, corresponded about Saint Germain with a mixture of fascination and unease. Casanova, a man of the world who prided himself on detecting frauds, met the Count and walked away convinced he had encountered something beyond ordinary explanation. Madame d'Adhemar, lady-in-waiting to Marie Antoinette, swore under oath that she met Saint Germain before the Revolution, then again decades later when she was elderly and he appeared unchanged. Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel, a rational ruler and Freemason, housed Saint Germain and recorded his observations with meticulous care, concluding that his guest was either immortal or the greatest actor ever born. And then the Count vanished from official records in 1784. The mystery should have ended there, calcified into history, becoming just another curious footnote in the annals of the unexplained. But it did not end. It evolved. 20th century reports began to surface, scattered and strange. Theosophists claimed Saint Germain as one of their ascended masters, a spiritual being guiding humanity from behind the veil. While easily dismissed as New Age fantasy, these claims attracted attention because they maintained elements from the historical accounts, details that required research to verify. Then came the stranger reports. A man matching Saint Germain's description allegedly appeared at the Palace of Versailles in 1972, speaking perfect 18th century French and displaying intimate knowledge of the palace's pre-revolutionary layout, details that had been lost to fire and renovation. Security escorted him out, but no one thought to ask his name until he had vanished into the crowds of Paris. Now, in the 21st century, the whispers have taken on a new character. They circulate in different circles now, among different witnesses, according to unverified reports that nonetheless maintain disturbing consistency. A man matching the historical descriptions has been seen at gatherings of global influence, United Nations, assemblies, economic forums in Davos, private meetings of think tanks that shape policy behind closed doors, always in the background, always watching, never speaking publicly but occasionally engaged in quiet conversation with leaders and power brokers who later refused to discuss what was said. One account from 2015 describes a delegate at a climate conference approached by a well-dressed man who spoke about environmental changes he had personally witnessed over 200 years. The delegate initially thought it was a metaphor, an artistic way of expressing concern. But the man described specific weather patterns from the 1770s, agricultural practices from the 1820s, industrial changes from the Victorian era, all with the casual precision of personal memory. When pressed for his credentials, he simply smiled and walked away. The delegate later tried to identify him through conference records. No one by that name had registered. Security footage from the hallway was inexplicably corrupted for that 20-minute window. Another report from 2018 involves a financial summit in Singapore. A silver-haired attendee, appearing perhaps 50 years old, casually mentioned economic patterns he had noticed since the Mississippi Bubble of 1720. He discussed the panic as if he had watched it unfold, describing the emotional fever in the streets of Paris, the particular desperation of investors who had wagered everything on paper promises. Other attendees assumed he was speaking historically, academically, but his details were too specific, too personal. He described the smell of the crowd, the sound of voices raised in anger and disbelief, the way afternoon lights slanted through windows in buildings that no longer existed. These accounts remain unverified. They exist in that gray space between rumor and documentation, too detailed to ignore, too strange to confirm. But they follow the pattern. They always follow the pattern. A man who appears educated and cultured, who possesses impossible knowledge, who never quite fits the moment he inhabits, who vanishes before questions can be properly asked. What are we to make of this? What explanation satisfies both reason and evidence? Was he truly immortal, a being who had discovered or been granted the secret to eternal life? The elixir of life he claimed to possess, was it real? Did he drink from some alchemical fountain that froze his body in time while his mind accumulated centuries? The idea violates everything we understand about biology, about aging, about the fundamental architecture of human cells. And yet, the alternative explanations fracture under scrutiny. Could Saint Germain have been a title, a role passed from one member of a secret society to another, each trained to impersonate their predecessor perfectly? This theory has merit, but it requires an organization of impossible discipline, maintaining a charade across centuries through wars and revolutions and the collapse of old orders, never breaking character, never leaving a paper trail. It requires each successive Saint Germain to memorize not just historical facts, but the lived texture of previous eras, the sensory details that only presence could provide. Or was he something else entirely? A time traveler, perhaps, visiting different eras with technology we cannot comprehend? An extraterrestrial observer, studying human civilization across its critical centuries of transformation? A psychic projection, a tulpa made manifest through collective belief. Each theory sounds more absurd than the last, and yet none can be definitively disproven. The documents exist. The witnesses testify. The pattern continues. And so we are left with questions that echo across the centuries. Who was the Comte de Saint-Germain? Where did he come from? What was his purpose in appearing when and where he did? Why did he choose to reveal himself to some and remain hidden from others? What game was he playing, and by what rules? If he still walks among us, still unchanged, still watching, what does he see? What does an immortal think when he observes the same human patterns repeating across centuries, the same mistakes, the same brief flashes of wisdom quickly forgotten? Does he help, subtly guiding key individuals toward better choices? Does he merely observe, collecting data for purposes we cannot fathom? Or does he play a deeper game, manipulating events across decades and centuries toward an end only he can envision. The modern sightings, if true, suggest he has adapted. He no longer appears at royal courts and aristocratic salons. He appears where power truly resides in our age, at gatherings of those who shape policy and economics, who direct the flow of resources and information. He has followed power as it shifted from crowns to capital, from palaces to conference centers. The pattern holds. He always appears where history is being made, where decisions echo forward through time. But we have only fragments, glimpses, reports that cannot be confirmed or denied. We have no answers, only the haunting persistence of the question itself. Perhaps that is the deepest mystery. Not who he was, but why we cannot let him go. Why after 300 years we still search for Saint Germain in crowds. Still wonder if that distinguished stranger with the penetrating gaze and impossible knowledge might be him. Why his legend refuses to calcify into mere history, but remains fluid, adapting to each new age, appearing in our modern myths with the same insistence he appeared in the salons of Enlightenment Europe. Maybe we need him to be real. Maybe the possibility of someone who has transcended death, who carries within himself the lived experience of centuries, who might understand the long arc of human civilization in a way we fragmented, mortal beings never can. Maybe that possibility answers some deep hunger in us. Or maybe we fear him. Fear what it would mean if someone truly could watch empires rise and fall like seasons, could see our entire lives as brief flickers in his endless continuum. The truth remains beyond our grasp. The Count de Saint-Germain, whether man, myth, or something that transcends both categories, has not revealed his final secret. He appears and vanishes, speaks and falls silent, demonstrates impossible knowledge, and offers no explanation. The pattern continues, the mystery deepens, and we who search for answers find only more questions. Somewhere in the world today, in a city whose name we do not know, a man might be walking who remembers Versailles before the revolution, who remembers the exact shade of afternoon light through the Hall of Mirrors, who remembers conversations with kings and philosophers whose bones have long since turned to dust. He might be unchanged, ageless, playing a game whose rules and purpose only he understands. He might be watching us even now, waiting for what we cannot say. The Count always said he would reveal himself when humanity was ready. But what if we never will be? Unreading. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.